Hello and welcome to Haunted Montreal Spooky Story Sessions. I'm your host, Holly Rhiannon, and today I'm going to tell you all about Old Montreal's forgotten cemeteries. Montreal is a city steeped in history, drawing millions of tourists every year. Most of them flock to Old Montreal, the historic district, home to cobblestone streets, European architecture, and fascinating landmarks. But what many of these visitors don't realize as they stroll through the area is that they're walking over something a little unexpected: the forgotten dead. Beneath the streets and buildings of Old Montreal lie numerous long-lost cemeteries. Some are marked and remembered, but most have been swallowed by time, their stories buried with them. And here's the part that interests us most. Many of these graveyards are said to be haunted. Quebec City has done a really good job at mapping out their historical cemeteries. They have a pretty clear idea of where their dead lie. Montreal, however, not so much. Here, it takes a good look into dusty historical accounts and faded maps to piece together where these graves might be. Even then, the reports don't always agree. Still, with some digging, pun intended, we know that the parish of Notre Dame's records from 1642 to 1800 document over 21,000 burials in Old Montreal. That's a lot of souls. The very first colonial cemetery in Montreal was located right beside Fort Ville-Marie, what the original settlement was called. This colony, founded on May 17, 1642 by the Notre Dame Society of Montreal for the conversion of the savage peoples of New France, always a favorite name there, not because it's a good thing, was built on Mohawk territory called Tiohtià:ke. And let's not sugarcoat it, if you've been here for a while, you know, the French did not have permission to be there. When the Mohawk scouts discovered this colony in their territory, the result was a pretty brutal conflict. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, a powerful alliance of 5 First Nations, at the time including the Mohawk, fought fiercely to protect their lands. And as you can imagine, that meant cemeteries filled up pretty fast. The first colonial burial site was established at Pointe-à-Calais, where the St. Pierre and St. Lawrence rivers once met. The first person to be buried there was Guillaume Boissier, a carpenter from Limousin, France, on June 9, 1643. Over the next 11 years, 37 more settlers and their allies would join him, many of them casualties of the violent clashes with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. What made the Pointe-à-Calais cemetery especially unique is that it wasn't exclusively for French settlers. This was one of the rare burial grounds where both Europeans and Indigenous people were interred together. Among the 38 people buried there, 12 were from the Anishinaabe and Wendat First Nation, allies of the French colonists. As for the French, the burial records include familiar names like Archambault, Bonenfant, David, Hébert, Tessier, and Thibault. Interestingly, this cemetery wasn't just a somber place of rest. In the book, The First Catholic Cemeteries of Montreal, it's described as a large meadow enlivened with the warblings of beautifully feathered birds and adorned with a variety of the most exquisite flowers. It probably brings to mind a serene, picturesque resting place where nature thrived and songbirds filled the air. It sounds really lovely, right? Well, the reality was a bit less idyllic. The cemetery's location, sandwiched between 2 rivers, caused frequent flooding. One particularly dramatic example happened on January 15, 1654, when a colonist named François Dedin was supposed to be buried. The floodwaters rose so high that the cemetery was inaccessible, and he had to be buried elsewhere. Where? That's a mystery. And if the flooding wasn't grim enough for you, there was another problem. The graves were quite shallow, only about 30 to 50 centimeters deep. Montreal's harsh winters and freeze-thaw cycles that followed often caused the bones to rise to the surface. Imagine walking through a cemetery and seeing bones suddenly poking up through the ground. Not exactly the peaceful meadow it was meant to be, and quite a bit worse than what you get from time to time on the mountain with the gophers digging things up. With all of these issues building, the cemetery was unsurprisingly officially closed in 1654. A new burial ground was established in the gardens of the Hôtel Dieu Hospital near St. Paul and St. Sulpice streets, close to the hospital chapel. But the Pointe-à-Calier site didn't vanish entirely. It holds a fascinating place in Montreal's history. Today, the remnants of this first cemetery are part of the Pointe-à-Calier Archaeology Museum. 7 of the original tombs have been excavated and are on display there in the basement. Visitors can get an up-close look at the early burials, but if you're wondering where are the rest of the bodies, oh, they're still there. They're just under the museum's floorboards. But back to that second cemetery. As the years rolled on, the cemetery began to fill as war continued. Many of the graves belonged to those who fell in battle, but others held victims of disease, accidents, and natural causes. Over time, the cemetery expanded with 2 annexes, one for the poor and another for the Indigenous people. But even in death, peace was hard to come by. Imagine this. Cattle wandering into the cemetery, trampling over graves, and, you guessed it, leaving behind unpleasant messes. After numerous complaints, the religious authorities finally addressed the issue. On November 30th, 1674, they gathered in the seminary and agreed to build a wooden fence around the cemetery to keep the livestock out. But it's hard to imagine that was much comfort for the souls buried there. By 1673, it was clear that the hospital cemetery was nearing capacity. That year, Montreal's third burial ground was opened in a commons area bordered by what we know now as St. Paul, St. Sacrament, St. Éloi, and St. Pierre streets. Unfortunately, this cemetery was also plagued by flooding in both the spring and fall, and the grazing cattle even made another appearance. Apparently, no one learned their lesson the first time. Between 1673 and 1682, roughly 400 people were buried in this common cemetery. But then, in 1683, things took a shocking turn. The Notre Dame parish, needing funds for a new church under construction, decided to auction off their burial ground. A colonist named Charles de Coignet purchased the land for 955 livres and quickly subdivided it into plots for sale. In 1695, just 3 years after the cemetery's closure, homes had already been built over the graves. A map from that time shows residential development completely overtaking what had once been sacred burial ground. No markers, no signs, just lives moving on over top of the dead. Today, this part of Old Montreal is packed with buildings. But don't let the charming streets and the preserved architecture fool you. This area has quite the reputation for paranormal activity. There are whispers of disembodied voices, eerie floating orbs, and restless spirits roaming the streets after dark. Who knows? The next time you are in Old Montreal, you might find yourself sharing the street with a specter. In 1680, Montreal saw the construction of a new, more permanent graveyard as part of the first Notre Dame church. Located on its southeast side, this cemetery became a coveted spot for Catholics. After all, what better place to spend eternity than right beside the church where you prayed in life? It quickly became a popular resting place for the faithful. Over the years, as the cemetery filled up, the parish bought up neighboring lots to expand the burial grounds. But here's something that might raise your eyebrows. Some people were actually buried inside the newly constructed church itself. That's right underfoot, beneath the very pews where worshippers gathered. A documentary called In the Shadows of Notre Dame sheds light on some interesting discoveries during excavation work at the old church site. In 2001, archaeologists were called in to investigate and relocate the graves. They uncovered over 100 skeletons in the old crypt and surrounding areas. After thoroughly recording and analyzing the remains, the bones were reburied at Notre Dame de Neige Cemetery on Mount Royal. Heading back in time once again, another cemetery opened in 1685 at Place d'Armes, but this one didn't last long. It was located at the northwest corner of Saint-Jacques and St. Francis Xavier streets, but after just a few years, the bodies were moved to a different location, just a short walk away. A chapel was even built where the Bank of Montreal stands today, a place to house the bodies waiting to be properly laid to rest. As all of this burial activity was happening, the colony was in the midst of ongoing warfare and unrest. In response, French authorities decided to fortify Montreal. Between 1687 and 1689, workers constructed a wooden palisade around the city, essentially turning Montreal into a fortified settlement. Then, between 1717 and 1744, those wooden defenses were replaced with stone walls built by Choscro de Lery, a military engineer working under King Louis XV. Over time, the Place d'Armes Cemetery continued to expand westward, with bodies buried right next to the stone fortifications. It's said that these walls and graves stand as a silent witness to the struggles and the stories of those who once called Montreal home. In 1718, a new cemetery was created just outside of the city walls, right next to the Charon Brothers General Hospital. This happened while the stone walls around Montreal were still being completed. The hospital itself had opened in 1694 as a charitable foundation with a noble mission: to care for the poor, orphans, the elderly, vulnerable individuals, and single women. It quickly became a vital part of the community. In 1747, management of the hospital was taken over by Sainte Marie Marguerite d'Youville and the Order of the Grey Nuns. Alongside the main cemetery, there was also a dedicated plot for the poor, those who couldn't afford a proper burial. In 1991, when work was being done to refurbish St. Pierre Street, archaeologists stumbled upon a haunting discovery: a mass grave beneath the road. They uncovered several children's skeletons, a pretty sad reminder of the lives that were lost during more difficult times. Today, granite markers are placed along the street to acknowledge the cemetery's location, with an interpretive sign standing next to the old General Hospital to remember those buried there. To the 1700s once again. In 1749, a new cemetery opened near the Powder Magazine, again said to be for the poor. This one was just slightly west of the Place d'Armes Cemetery, continuing the trend of burial grounds expanding westward along the city's northern wall, and eventually beyond it. But here's where things get tricky. With so many cemeteries in the area, many of which had been forgotten and desecrated, it becomes nearly impossible to separate them all. The lines between burial sites blur, leaving behind scattered and unmarked graves. The late historian E.A. Collard paints a vivid picture of these cemeteries in his writings. He explains that the principal burial grounds were located just inside the northern wall, an area marked by Fortification Lane today. These cemeteries stretched from close to the wall to about the middle of what is now St. James Street, from St. Francis Xavier to the beginnings of Victoria Square. Essentially, the buildings on the north side of St. James Street now stand atop these old burial grounds. When Montreal fell to the British in 1760, the new colonial rulers also created Protestant cemeteries in the same vicinity. But by then, much of the old burial ground had already been forgotten. Collard recounts that when foundations and cellars for buildings on St. James Street were being dug, many bones were unearthed, and in some cases they weren't fully removed. They were simply left behind, resting where they had been buried centuries before. In fact, there's a story that's been passed down through the years, telling of a cellar full of bones. The tale comes from a building at or near the corner of St. James Street and Victoria Square. An 1872 report from the Montreal Gazette recalls a gentleman who, as a child, had lived on St. James Street. He spoke of a wine cellar so deep it was almost paved with bones and skulls. None of the servants could be persuaded to go down there alone, except for one old butler who cared so much for the wine that he wasn't afraid of the ghosts. In his words, not even a dozen graveyards full of spirits could scare him away from his precious bottles. Now, with all of the luxurious buildings that have sprung up along St. James Street, there's a lingering question. Are they haunted? After all, many of these buildings were constructed right on top of old cemeteries that once, of course, had remains of the dead. Take, for example, the separate cemeteries once created for the poor, Black people, and Indigenous people by the French colonies. It's a little-known piece of Montreal's past that raises a few questions today. In the February 1885 edition of Le Patrie, a column titled Le Bon Vieux Temps mentions the Black Cemetery in Montreal, dating back to 1800. The article notes that the cemetery was located at the corner of Saint Jacques and Saint Pierre Streets, precisely where the Mechanics' Institute was eventually built. Today, that very spot is home to the former Royal Bank of Canada, now occupied by the popular Crew Collective and Cafe. And it seems the spirits of the past haven't quite moved on. Locals and workers at the cafe have reported strange paranormal occurrences. Malfunctioning coffee machines, flickering lights, and even doors opening and closing on their own. Could it be that the ghosts of those whose graves were disturbed are still roaming the halls, reminding us of their forgotten stories? Another example can be found on a colonial map where a cartographer made a note of Cimetière du Sauvage, located just outside the city walls to the north of the Sulpician Cemetery. Not much is known about the cemetery, though. Who was buried there? Were they Indigenous people who were killed or executed by the French authorities? Or were they those who had converted to Catholicism before passing? Maybe it was even a cemetery that existed long before the French even set foot on the island. The truth is not something we're clear about at this time. However, today, the site where the cemetery once stood is home to a luxury condominium called Les Étoiles. And yet, there's no historical plaque to mark this lost piece of history. And there are rumors that the underground parking beneath the building is haunted. While the reports that we have received provide little to no detail aside from a general suspicion, it seems that there are more than a few people believing that spirits still linger in this spot. More research is needed, but we have a feeling that this story is far from over. And speaking of haunted sites, let's take a look at the St. James Theatre. This grand building, now a well-known venue, was built in 1907 on the site of the former Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce. But before the bank, there was the Great St. James Street Church, built in 1845, Montreal's most comfortable and welcoming house of worship. The church was adored by its parishioners, and its magnificent interior and beautiful stained glass windows made it a beloved place to spend time. So much so, in fact, that the Methodist Church made many converts, and some even called it heaven on earth. It was said that when its parishioners passed away, their souls would drift up into the rafters, eager to spend eternity there. But in 1907, the church was demolished to make room for the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce, where the stained glass windows were incorporated into the wall behind the bank's counter. During construction, workers unearthed 2 skeletons while digging the foundations. Now, given that Old Montreal is riddled with forgotten cemeteries, this discovery was disturbing, but hardly surprising. As the bank neared completion, whispers started to spread. Some said the building might be cursed or haunted. After all, replacing a house of worship with a house of capitalism, well, that might just be the kind of thing to upset the balance in the spiritual world. As you might imagine, strange paranormal activity started surfacing once the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce opened its doors. From the very first day of operation, bank tellers reported an unsettling feeling. The most common description? It felt like someone, or something, was staring at them from behind. As the days and weeks went on, the feeling of unease only grew stronger. The bank began to take on an oppressive atmosphere of a funeral home, and employees began experiencing strange problems. There were high turnover rates and frequent absences. But the most bizarre experiences were yet to come. The stunning stained glass windows, the ones behind the tellers' desks, began to slowly change. The vibrant reds, greens, yellows, and blues were fading, taking on the color of human bone. Within a month, something even more disturbing happened. 2 large human skulls appeared within the windows, silently watching both clients and employees. Adding to all of this, the building also housed the Montreal offices of the White Star Line. This is where passengers purchased tickets for the RMS Titanic. So, when the Titanic struck an iceberg and sank on April 15, 1912, the bank became even more ominous, with an additional layer of tragedy haunting its halls. As the years went on, the issues only intensified. Employees dreaded working there, and clients complained that the skulls in the stained glass windows ruined their banking experience. They said the skulls were intimidating and seemed to bring bad luck. In fact, some clients even started moving their investments to other banks, anything to escape the morose atmosphere and the cursed skulls that seemed to linger in the windows, silently judging the room. By the early 1960s, the situation had become unbearable. In response, officials made the decision to build a new, modern 45-story CIBC bank tower. The head office vacated the St. James location in 1962 and moved to a new downtown spot. Fast forward to 2012, and the old bank building was finally repurposed. The owners of the Rialto Theatre purchased the formal Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce and rebranded it as the St. James Theatre. After a complete renovation, the venue now serves as a high-end location for weddings, parties, and private corporate events. Whether the spirits that haunted the bank still remain disturbing the theater is unclear. However, the strange skulls in the stained glass windows do continue to watch over every event, staring down on the guests at lavish gatherings. But the crypts and forgotten burial grounds of Old Montreal are not limited to the bank building. Beneath the Notre Dame Basilica and Notre Dame de Bon Secours Church, crypts full of bodies remain. And there are other long-demolished churches, chapels, and institutions like the Mother House of the Sisters of Notre Dame that likely still harbor remains buried underneath the earth. In 1799, the Attorney General of Lower Canada made a dramatic move to stop all burials within the walls of Montreal. With the British takeover and an influx of Protestant settlers, the pressure on the city's already cramped cemeteries grew overwhelming. In just 40 years, Montreal's population had quadrupled to 5,000 residents, and space for the dead was quickly running out. The growing number of bodies within the city walls became a cause for concern. There were fears that diseases like cholera and smallpox could spread from the decaying remains of the infected. In response, the church wardens of Notre Dame Parish submitted a petition to close the burial grounds. The Attorney General approved the petition, and in 1799, all cemeteries within the walls were officially closed. In the same year, authorities opened two new cemeteries far beyond the city walls, the Protestant burying ground and the Catholic St. Antoine Cemetery, to contain the growing tide of the dead. Yet even these eventually filled, leading to the creation of burial grounds atop Mount Royal in the mid-1800s. Today, as visitors wander the cobblestone streets of Montreal, they unknowingly tread upon a city built over countless forgotten graves. The true extent of these burial sites remains shrouded in mystery, their locations whispered about but rarely confirmed. Perhaps one day, with further research, the map of Montreal's hidden dead will finally be unveiled. But until then, the spirits buried below remain restless, their secrets waiting to be unearthed. That's it for today's episode, but before we wrap up, we would love to hear from you. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to stay updated on all of our latest videos. Share your thoughts on this episode, and feel free to include a ghost story of your own if you would like. For more stories, be sure to check out the blog by Donovan King over at hauntedmontreal.com, where you can also get tickets for in-person haunted storytelling experiences. We'll be back with new videos in both French and English in a couple weeks, but until then, stay spooky.